It was supposed to be an ordinary journey. On the evening of June 4, 1989, two passenger trains were moving through the southern Ural region of the Soviet Union. One was heading east, the other west. Both were full. Families, children, students, soldiers on leave. People traveling south for summer holidays, people returning home. There was nothing unusual about the route. The tracks ran through forests and low hills, far from major cities. No stations nearby, no crowds, just darkness, rails, and the steady rhythm of motion. Inside the cars, people slept, talked quietly, or stared out of windows into the night. No warnings were issued, no delays were announced, nothing suggested danger. Somewhere beneath the ground, several hundred meters from the railway line, a gas pipeline was leaking. The pipeline carried liquefied petroleum gas, a mixture of propane and butane, under high pressure. The leak had likely begun hours earlier, possibly longer. Gas escaped continuously, spreading into the surrounding terrain. The geography mattered. The railway passed through a shallow valley. At night, the air was still. Heavy gas accumulated close to the ground, pooling invisibly between trees, along embankments, and around the tracks. There was no smell inside the trains, no visible sign outside. From the perspective of the passengers, the journey was uneventful. Inside one carriage, children slept on bunks, their parents nearby. In another, travelers shared food, preparing to rest before morning. Some passengers had opened windows slightly to let in cool night air. None of them knew they were entering a cloud of fuel. The trains continued at speed. Control centers monitored schedules, not the landscape. Dispatchers focused on timing, spacing, and efficiency. The line was active. Traffic was heavy. Stopping a train required a reason. There was no official reason. The gas continued to accumulate. By the time the two trains approached each other, the concentration in the valley had reached a critical level. The cloud stretched for kilometers along the tracks. It hugged the ground, undisturbed, waiting for an ignition source. The passengers did not feel fear. They did not feel urgency. They did not feel anything unusual at all. When the trains drew closer, metal wheels rolled over steel rails. Brakes adjusted speed. Electrical systems operated normally. Sparks, common, insignificant, routine, appeared beneath the cars. Under ordinary conditions, they meant nothing. That night, they were enough. The moment the trains passed each other, the cloud ignited. The explosion did not begin with sound. It began with light. A sudden, overwhelming flash filled the valley, instantly transforming darkness into fire. In less than a second, the gas cloud became a wall of flame. Temperatures rose beyond survivable limits. The blast expanded outward, lifting rail cars, tearing them apart, and igniting everything combustible. For the people inside the trains, there was no time to react. There was no time to understand what was happening. For many, the journey ended before they were aware it had become dangerous. The night that had begun as routine had crossed a point of no return, and by the time the fire reached its full force, there would be no way to count how many lives it had already taken. The explosion was not random. It was shaped by geography. The railway line passed through a shallow valley carved between low forested hills. Under normal conditions, this mattered little. But on that night, the terrain became a trap. The gas pipeline ran parallel to the tracks at a distance of several hundred meters. It carried liquefied petroleum gas under high pressure, moving continuously through the system. At some point, a rupture formed in the pipe. The exact cause was never fully established. It may have been corrosion. It may have been mechanical stress. It may have been a defect that had gone unnoticed for years. What mattered was the result. Pressurized gas escaped into the open air and began spreading outward. Propane and butane are heavier than air. Instead of rising, the gas stayed low, flowing downhill and filling depressions in the terrain. The valley collected it. At night, conditions were ideal for accumulation. The air was cool and still. There was no strong wind to disperse the gas. The cloud thickened gradually, invisible and silent. Gas detectors were installed along parts of the pipeline system. Their purpose was to identify pressure drops and leaks. That night, pressure irregularities were recorded. They were not treated as urgent. Such fluctuations were not uncommon. Pipelines were long, complex systems. Minor leaks were expected. The standard response was monitoring, not immediate shutdown. Shutting down the line would have disrupted supply. Disruption required justification. No one saw flames. No one smelled gas from a distance. No alarms demanded action. As hours passed, the cloud expanded. It crept along the ground, through trees and brush, across embankments and ballast. It reached the railway corridor and settled there. The concentration increased slowly, crossing thresholds that no one was measuring. Inside the trains, windows were open. This was normal. Summer nights were warm. Passengers relied on airflow for comfort. The gas entered the carriages unnoticed, mixing with ordinary air. No one coughed, no one panicked. There was no warning sensation. The valley amplified the danger by containing it. Once the gas concentration reached a critical level, the system became unstable. All that was required was an ignition source, not a flame, not an explosion, but a spark. Railways produce sparks constantly. Steel wheels contact steel rails. Braking systems generate friction. Electrical components create arcs. Under normal circumstances, this is harmless. That night, it was catastrophic. The valley ensured that the gas did not disperse. The pipeline ensured a continuous supply. The railway ensured ignition. None of these elements alone would have caused disaster. Together, they made it inevitable. By the time the trains entered the lowest point of the valley, the cloud was fully formed. It stretched beyond the visible area, concentrated enough to burn instantly and violently. There was no margin for error left. The environment had done its work quietly and completely. All that remained was timing. The disaster did not unfold without signals. They simply failed to stop the system. Hours before the explosion, pressure readings along the pipeline began to change. Operators noticed irregularities, small drops followed by partial stabilization. This suggested a leak, but not necessarily a critical one. In long-distance gas transport, such fluctuations were familiar. The standard response was observation. Technicians monitored gauges and charts. The data did not point to a rupture large enough to justify an emergency shutdown. No flames were reported. No visible damage was detected. From a control room perspective, the system appeared stressed, but functional. Railway operations continued independently. The pipeline and the railway were managed by different authorities with different chains of command. Communication between them was limited and procedural. Information moved slowly and cautiously, filtered through responsibility and protocol. No one ordered trains to stop. Stopping a passenger train at night in a remote area required a clear and immediate threat. There was none that could be formally stated. A suspected gas leak without confirmation was not enough. Minutes passed, then hours. As the gas continued to escape, the situation worsened on the ground, but improved on paper. Pressure stabilized enough to suggest the leak was manageable. The possibility that gas was pooling in a low-lying valley near an active railway was not part of the model. No one was watching the terrain. At the railway dispatch centers, attention remained on schedules. 2 passenger trains were approaching each other on the same stretch of track. This was routine. Their crossing point had been calculated and approved. There was no instruction to slow them down. There was no alert to crews. There was no warning to passengers. Some reports later suggested that workers near the pipeline smelled gas earlier that evening. Others claimed vegetation had begun to wither along the route. These accounts were inconsistent and surfaced only after the fact. At the time, nothing reached the level of an actionable report. The system depended on certainty. It required proof before intervention. It required confirmation before disruption. By the time certainty existed, there would be no opportunity to act. The final warning came too late to matter. As the trains entered the valley, the pressure readings no longer reflected the danger below. The gas cloud had already formed. Its presence was disconnected from the instruments meant to detect it. The system believed it was under control. The environment disagreed. When the trains passed each other, the chain of ignored signals reached its end. Decisions made hours earlier, to wait, to monitor, to avoid disruption, converged into a single moment. What followed was not a failure of technology alone. It was the failure of coordination, urgency, and imagination, the inability to consider what could happen outside the data. The warnings had existed. They simply did not fit the framework required to stop the trains. The 2 trains were not late. They were not speeding. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. One was traveling east, the other west, each carrying hundreds of passengers through the night. Their schedules had been calculated hours earlier. The crossing point was fixed. Crews followed instructions. Signals were clear. From an operational standpoint, everything was normal. Inside the locomotives, drivers focused on routine tasks. Speed adjustments were minor. Braking systems responded as expected. The tracks ahead were dark, empty, and silent. Neither crew could see the valley filling with gas. As the trains descended into the low point of the terrain, they entered the densest part of the cloud. The gas was concentrated near the ground, spreading across the ballast and rising just high enough to envelop the lower sections of the cars. Windows were open. Ventilation systems drew in outside air. The gas entered the trains gradually, without triggering any immediate reaction. There was no sharp smell strong enough to alarm passengers, no sudden change that would prompt action. The 2 trains continued toward each other. From a distance, their lights appeared as ordinary points in the darkness, growing brighter as they closed the gap. This was a familiar sight along busy rail lines, 2 scheduled movements intersecting briefly before continuing on separate paths. There was no reason to expect anything else. As the trains approached the crossing point, mechanical processes occurred automatically. Brakes adjusted pressure, metal components vibrated, electrical systems maintained power. Tiny sparks appeared beneath the cars, a common byproduct of rail travel. Under normal conditions, these sparks were meaningless. Inside the gas cloud, they were sufficient. When the leading sections of the trains aligned, ignition occurred almost instantly. The flame front expanded faster than human perception. What followed was not a single explosion, but a rapid sequence: ignition, expansion, and combustion sweeping through the valley. The blast force lifted rail cars from the tracks. Some were thrown aside, others collapsed inward as the pressure wave passed through them. Temperatures rose to levels that left no chance for survival in exposed areas. For passengers closest to the center of the blast, the event was instantaneous. There was no escape, no time to react, no opportunity to understand. Further from the center, people experienced a different reality. Shock waves shattered windows. Fire rushed through corridors. Darkness was replaced by light, then smoke. The trains, which moments earlier had been moving symbols of routine travel, became fragmented structures scattered across the landscape. The meeting of the two trains marked the exact point where accumulated risk became irreversible reality. Everything before that moment had been delay. Everything after would be consequence. What occurred in the valley was not a conventional blast. It was a volumetric explosion, the ignition of a massive cloud of gas mixed with air. Unlike explosives that detonate at a single point, this kind of explosion unfolds across space. The flame does not originate from one center and dissipate outward. It races through the cloud, consuming it almost simultaneously. The scale was determined by accumulation. Hours of leakage had allowed gas to spread across kilometers of terrain. When ignition occurred, the entire volume became fuel. The resulting fireball expanded rapidly, generating extreme heat and pressure over a wide area. Temperatures rose to levels capable of melting metal. Rail cars closest to the center were exposed instantly. Aluminum components softened and failed. Steel structures warped. Interiors ignited in fractions of a second. Passengers inside these cars had no chance to escape. Further away, the effects were uneven. Some cars were lifted from the tracks and thrown aside. Others remained upright but were engulfed in flames. Windows shattered, doors jammed. Fire spread through corridors and compartments, fed by combustible materials and continuous airflow. The blast wave traveled outward, knocking down trees and flattening vegetation. The surrounding forest ignited, adding secondary fires to the primary inferno. The night sky became illuminated for kilometers. Witnesses later described the light as brighter than daylight. The sound followed after. A deep, sustained roar accompanied the combustion, echoing through the hills. It was not a sharp bang, but a prolonged release of energy as the cloud burned itself out. Inside the trains, survival depended entirely on location. Passengers at the periphery of the blast experienced intense heat and shock, but remained alive. Some were thrown from bunks, others were pinned by debris. Smoke filled the cars quickly, reducing visibility to nothing. Injuries varied: burns, lacerations, fractures, asphyxiation. Many who survived the initial explosion were trapped. Rail cars were deformed, exits were blocked, fire cut off escape routes. Darkness returned as power systems failed. The environment compounded the damage. The valley concentrated heat and smoke. Flames moved along the tracks and into nearby woods. Wind conditions shifted as the fire consumed oxygen, creating unpredictable currents that spread burning debris. Emergency response was not immediate. The location was remote. There were no nearby stations. Communication infrastructure was limited. Initial reports were confused and incomplete. Dispatch centers struggled to understand what had happened. For those inside the wreckage, time lost meaning. Minutes felt endless. Movement was slow. Breathing became difficult. The explosion itself lasted seconds. The fire that followed lasted much longer. And by the time the flames began to subside, the landscape had been permanently altered. Rails twisted, cars destroyed, and hundreds of lives irreversibly changed. What had been a routine crossing of two trains had become one of the deadliest railway disasters in history. When the fire began to lose intensity, the valley did not return to darkness. It filled with smoke. Burning vegetation, melted materials, and damaged rail cars produced thick, choking air that settled low to the ground. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The heat lingered, radiating from twisted metal and scorched earth. Survivors began to move. Those who could walk searched for openings in deformed cars. Windows without glass became exits. People climbed down embankments, helped strangers, carried children. Many were injured, some were badly burned, others were in shock, unable to speak. There was no organized rescue at first. The location was isolated. The nearest settlements were small. Emergency services were not positioned for an event of this scale. Initial calls described a fire, then an explosion, then something impossible to explain. Confusion delayed response. Local residents were the first to arrive. They moved toward the glow they could see from kilometers away, not knowing what they would find. Some attempted to pull survivors from wreckage. Others brought water, blankets, anything they had. The danger did not end with the flames. Gas continued to burn intermittently as pockets ignited. Rail cars remained unstable. Metal surfaces were hot enough to cause burns on contact. Smoke made breathing difficult, especially for those already injured. Medical assistance was overwhelmed. Ambulances arrived in waves, but there were too few. Makeshift triage areas formed along the tracks and nearby roads. Doctors and nurses worked without clear information, treating burns, fractures, and respiratory injuries simultaneously. Many victims required immediate evacuation. Helicopters were brought in to transport the most severely injured to hospitals in nearby cities. Roads became congested with emergency vehicles. Coordination improved slowly as the scale of the disaster became clear. By dawn, the full extent of the damage was visible. Dozens of rail cars were destroyed or heavily damaged. The surrounding forest was burned black. The ground was littered with debris. Personal belongings lay scattered. Luggage, clothing, children's toys, silent markers of interrupted journeys. The number of casualties was still uncertain. Some bodies were recovered quickly. Others remained trapped inside collapsed cars. Fires had destroyed identifying documents. In some cases, remains could not be separated or identified. Families waited for information that did not come. Lists were incomplete. Names were missing. Hospitals struggled to communicate with authorities. The process of accounting for passengers would take weeks, and even then, it would remain imperfect. The aftermath extended beyond the site. Hospitals across the region operated at capacity. Burn units were overwhelmed. Long-term care began immediately for those who survived with severe injuries. For the country, the disaster could no longer be ignored, but how it would be acknowledged, and by whom, remained uncertain. Once the immediate crisis passed, the focus shifted from rescue to explanation. Investigative commissions were formed quickly. Representatives from the railway authorities, the gas industry, emergency services, and state oversight bodies arrived at the site. Each institution brought its own reports, procedures, and language. The question was simple. Who was responsible? The answers were not. The gas pipeline had leaked, but pipelines leaked before. Pressure fluctuations had been recorded, but not at levels that automatically required shutdown. The railway had continued operations, but no formal warning had reached dispatchers with the authority to stop trains. Each system had functioned according to its own rules. Individually, no single action violated protocol in a way that was easy to isolate. Collectively, those actions had produced catastrophe. This made responsibility difficult to assign. Reports emphasized technical complexity. They referenced equipment wear, environmental conditions, and procedural gaps. Language was precise and detached. Failures were described as systemic rather than personal. No single operator was blamed. No dispatcher was publicly held accountable. No official decision was identified as the turning point. The investigation produced conclusions without names. The gas industry pointed to monitoring standards. The railway cited the absence of a confirmed hazard. Oversight bodies focused on coordination issues rather than culpability. Recommendations were issued to improve communication, enhance detection, and revise safety distances. These recommendations came after the fact. For the families of victims, the process offered little clarity. There was no clear narrative to explain how an ordinary journey had become fatal. Compensation was distributed unevenly, often through administrative decisions rather than legal judgments. Public discussion was restrained. The disaster occurred during a period of political transition. Openness was increasing, but institutional habits remained. Media coverage acknowledged the event, but avoided deep examination of responsibility. The story moved forward without resolution. Internally, lessons were absorbed quietly. Pipeline monitoring was adjusted, safety protocols were revised, coordination procedures were rewritten. The systems changed, but without public reckoning. This absence mattered. Without accountability, the disaster became an abstraction. It was recorded as a tragic event, not as a sequence of preventable decisions. The focus shifted to recovery and remembrance, not to failure and reform. Responsibility dissolved into structure. The system survived intact, and with time, attention moved on. The disaster did not disappear immediately. It faded. In the weeks that followed, the explosion was reported, acknowledged, and mourned. Funerals were held, survivors were treated. Memorials appeared quietly, without ceremony. For a moment, the scale of the tragedy was undeniable. Then, history moved on. The late 1980s were crowded with events. Political change accelerated. Old structures weakened. New crises competed for attention. In that noise, a railway disaster, however devastating, struggled to hold a permanent place. There was no single image that defined it. No reactor building, no evacuated city, no long-term exclusion zone. The explosion left destruction, but not a landmark. The tracks were repaired. The forest grew back. Trains resumed running through the valley. The physical signs of what had happened diminished with time. Memory followed. The disaster lacked a simple symbol. It had no name recognized outside the region. It was tied to systems, pipelines, schedules, procedures, rather than to a single dramatic failure. Explaining it required context, coordination, and patience. Those qualities rarely survive headlines. For many survivors, silence returned as a default. Speaking about the event did not change outcomes. Responsibility had already dissolved. Life continued, altered, but ongoing. The absence of a clear narrative made personal stories harder to share. Outside the country, awareness was minimal. The Cold War ended. Archives opened selectively. Attention shifted to events that fit cleaner frameworks of cause and consequence. The railway disaster remained complex, technical, and uncomfortable. It did not become a lesson. It became a footnote. Yet the conditions that produced it were not unique. They existed wherever systems operated independently, where risk accumulated invisibly, and where intervention required certainty that could never fully arrive in time. The disaster was not an anomaly, it was a convergence. An ordinary night, a familiar route, a routine decision to continue. The trains did not fail because of sabotage or intent. They failed because everything around them was allowed to function normally while danger formed unnoticed. That is why the story matters, not because it was forgotten, but because it was forgettable in the way systems prefer. Distributed responsibility, delayed recognition, quiet absorption of loss. The journey became the deadliest, not by design, but by reminder of how easily routine becomes irreversible, of how silence follows chaos, of how tragedy can pass without changing the structures that enabled it. The tracks were repaired, the schedule resumed, and the valley returned to darkness,